All right, it's Tim's turn. I'm debriefing from a trip to Roaring Spring yesterday, Wednesday. And I talked about Mervyn and I talked about Audrey. Well, I'm sorry. When I left Danny Kaye's and Audrey, and I mentioned to Sheena that I wondered if she'd be interested in a guitar, a house guitar, a guitar there belonging to the house that visitors could just pick up and play if they wanted to. And she thought, well, maybe, yeah, but I didn't have it. All right, and I got in a car and just went down the road, just like a couple 100 yards maybe, and parked right there at the Spring Dam Brewery. Now, it was only about 15 minutes, maybe a half hour after they had opened for the week. This is Wednesday. And I try to get there by, say, 4:30, 4 o'clock, 4:30, because it's one of the slowest times of the whole week. And I have a chance to talk quietly to clientele or to the brewer himself. And I went in there carrying a guitar in a case. And this was the guitar, a good guitar, I think. It's a Yamaha that I was hoping that they would accept as a house guitar for the Spring Dam Brewery, to just have it in sight. And I had it in there before the last time, and the brewer, Mike, he looked at it and he kind of liked it. He seemed like he was approving of the idea. So I told him I had it. I put it there and I said, it's the same guitar you looked at. And if you don't want it, just give it to Jeremy, who's the bartender that I've praised. So that was done. Now, and I actually think I did that toward the end of the visit. But anyway, I ordered a dark beer, and I remember that it was almost a year ago. That was the kind of beer that was brewed there that made me kind of immediately decide, aha, now this is good beer, a dark beer, not a stout, but a dark beer, and not a porter either. So I was enjoying it, and it was kind of quiet. There wasn't really anybody to speak to other than a little bit of talk with the brewer, but and then I liked that. It was quiet, and I could think about the day. And I was about getting ready to leave when a guy about 5 stools down at the bar said hi. And I think I said, what was that? My hearing isn't great, isn't that great? And he said, oh, I was just saying hello, just hi. And I said, well, hi. I then started, it was Tim, then started what I usually do when I meet somebody in that area. I say, are you from here? And he said, yeah, he was. I moved a stool down, so I was a little bit closer to him so I could hear what he was saying. And I said, do you work around here? And he said, well, he's an independent contractor and has been all his life. I asked, for a while we talked about his work. And it turns out that he's not just an ordinary independent contractor. He builds houses by himself. He was involved in the renovation of the Mishler Theater in Altoona, which was like $100,000 or more project. I didn't even know about it, but they've renovated the inside. He was putting gold leaf on the plaster in places as doing it, and we talked about that. And I told him, I'd been a carpenter for a couple of years, and I liked it, but I liked the rough part. I was a rough carpenter, and we talked carpentry for a while, and then hanging drywall. He said that was something that I could do. I could tape drywall, but I never really liked it, and he I don't need to. His son, one of his sons, is brilliant at it, I guess, suddenly, and And he also he kind of had facts and figures about the drywall. He's hung by himself. Yeah, unbelievable. And the bartender, or no, the brewer came out, and I mentioned to Tim, I said, well, Mike used to hang drywall too, because I noticed that the brewer, when I was first there, he always had a pencil behind his ear. And I commented on that, and I said, you look like a carpenter with that pencil behind your ear. And he'd said, well, I hung drywall. He admitted that it was, but he hated it. He said, if anybody asked him, can you tape drywall or hang drywall? The brewer said, no, I can't, because he doesn't want to do it. But I understand. All right, but anyway, then we talked as normal conversation about, do we know anybody in common? Because I said, I'm from Roaring Spring, I was born here. But then I moved away, and I've told that story a lot, and we talked some about that. It turned out Tim, he was orphaned. And how did he get to Roaring Spring? I'm just not sure, probably, but at a pretty young age, he came to Roaring Spring and went through the school system. And I said, where do you learn the trade? And he explained that, well, since he was an orphan, there was a school close to Philadelphia, I think, that trained orphans. And so that discussion went on. And then we turned to, do we know anybody in common? Well, it turns out that my sister, my youngest sister, who owns a house by the Spring Dam, one of her brothers-in-law is named Fred. And Fred and Tim were, maybe still are, the very best of friends. So here there was a connection, and all this was going on. So it was fine. And at a certain point then, a barmaid that was there, and she kind of interrupted and started up a conversation of her own with Tim. And but I waited kind of patiently, because there were two things I wanted to mention to Tim, since he was a carpenter. It turned out to be three. I told him about what I was hoping for in the spring at the paper mill site cleanup, the pollarding and coppicing of the bank. I asked, he didn't know those words either, but I explained it to him. He was all enthusiastic about that. He says, count me in on that. I'll help. I got free, I'm widowed. I've got free time on the weekends. I've got the chainsaws. Count me in on that if you can pull it off. And we also talked about the effect it was going to have on real estate in that area. I wanted to talk about that. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was the mills, because he had lived in Woodbury. Maybe that was where he first came to the Cove. I'm just not sure. But he had lived in Woodbury, and he knew that area very well. When I talked about the mills that I had seen in my drive around, in my loop that I posted about just recently, he knew them all. And he even knew that little tiny stone one. I had to do some explaining to say where that was, but he knew that. He knew where that was, and he knew about at least one other like that one that he couldn't really explain it to me. Oh, and I told him about Waterside, where the rafters come down to the plate, that the plate was pretty clearly broken, and that mill was then going to end up coming down if it wasn't repaired. He was into the idea of repairing that too. Now, he's a carpenter, skilled all his life. He knows what he's doing. And he said the next time he's around there, he'll take a look at it again. But we knew just what we were talking about, and so there's hope right there that some volunteer effort can be put together to work on these mills. So that was pretty much it. With that, by this time I'd ordered a second beer because the conversation was just that good. And I'm sure he and I are going to work closely. Oh, one other thing. I mentioned to him the Blank Book Factory. And I was saying about the owners of it seemed to think it would cost so much money to have it looking decent again. He said he knew that building and it was really strong and all. And I said, yeah, but the wooden trim around the windows and stuff, since you've done all that plaster work, you might know about that. You know, it wouldn't have to be authentic or anything. It just could it be made solid again. And he said, oh yeah, that could be done. All right, I guess that's maybe enough. I came home and when I got home, I found out that a post that I had tried to put on only in the Cove about those mills that drive around those 9 or to 12 mills down there, it had been accepted. It was put on there and it already had one response. The last I looked today, there were 53 people had responded to that, and one of them is actually doing a study of the grist mills of Morrison's Cove. So it was a very satisfying day. Bye for now.